So this is work that we have done together, and we have been looking into one wildlife management process and one process within forestry. Both of them can be described as collaborative governance processes, and there is a facilitator. So we, or rather Emily and Lars, have done observations of how these facilitators work in view, and then we have analyzed in view of understanding how they use power. And we have tried to look at the use of power in terms of authority and argumentation and movement between the two. And I will explain how and why. So this is work which we have published in the special issue to the right-hand side between authority and argumentation. Facilitators use of power in collaborative governance. And then we have ongoing work, me and Emily, also supported by Lars, where we look into authority and facilitation practice and try to further develop the idea through a conceptual framework. This is not published yet, that paper. So what is facilitation? I think it's a core practice within environmental communication. It's a role that practitioners play. It has to do with structuring communication. So it's about leading conversations, and it's quite a subtle form of leadership. We need to follow from the front, one can say, a paradoxical way of leading. So you will have to be very attentive, and you have to follow the group and the people that you work with, but you also sometimes have to take a step forward and lead, actually, to structure the conversation and to make sure that all voices are heard if that's needed, or also influencing who can talk and moving away from maybe misplaced unwillingness to enter into conflicts, for example, as we have seen in many processes that people are reluctant to do that. So it's a kind of leadership that is quite subtle and difficult and interesting to do and to try to understand. And we have then tried to understand this form of leadership by looking at leadership in terms of authority. And authority is often perceived as something that has no place in dialogues and collaborative processes in our field. We find that to be problematic because all leadership will require some kind of a legitimate use of power. Hence, it requires authority. We have tried to deal with that problem, the problematic treatment of authority in facilitation practice and the literature, by exploring the links between authority and argumentation in practice. So how are authority and argumentation linked in facilitation practice? In the recent work that we have done on what we call paper 2, the second paper which is not published, we have identified a number of 3 power moves that facilitators can make when they structure communication. We have looked into sequencing, which is about deciding who can speak and when they can speak and in which order they can speak, but also about how you design a process over longer term, sequences of meetings or agendas for meetings. It's quite an influential kind of power because it structures the conversation, so we can who can speak and who cannot speak, and also the order of topics is important because it influences how the conversation plays out and also what might be outcomes in terms of after the process. We have also identified framing as one of the power moves that facilitators can make. It has to do with how you address a topic. So will you talk about problems with wildlife, or will you talk about possibilities with wildlife? Will you talk about difficulties we have with conflicts when we manage our common concerns, or will you talk about possibilities? So it is quite an important way of using power, which will shape how the communication is taking place in conversations. And then finally, we have identified concluding as one of the power moves. And that's when the facilitator is together with the group or by themselves, summarizing, formulating next steps, trying to cover what has been discussed, draw conclusions about meeting content and the topic and the relationships that have been discussed in a particular process. So these 3 power moves we have identified, and then we have identified them by looking at these 2 processes that I mentioned, the wildlife management process and the forestry process, and then we have tried to understand how they are related to this movement between authority and argumentation that the facilitators are doing. I will exemplify now with a short example from the wildlife management process, where there was this event that we looked into more carefully. The facilitator wanted to open the meeting in what we have called a strongly argumentative mood, which means that the facilitator opened up for a conversation. So she said, I'm thinking I want to start by asking you if there is something in particular that you want to talk about, or should we dive into this discussion on this working method? So this was an open way of acting in the beginning of the meeting, inviting a conversation, a sequence of argumentation on the content for the meeting. And she also made a suggestion then to discuss this working method. And the working method, I have to explain a little bit, because it was about how to measure this particular species that was under discussion here. So it was quite a controversial issue. The method had implications for these discussions about conserving or protecting this wildlife resource, or doing away with it. So it was a controversial issue between environmentalists and those who wanted to hunt these animals. She opened up this conversation, and then she might have expected a technical discussion about this working method, but what she got was a really contentious discussion where there were feelings and emotions, sometimes running a bit high. So one of the participants said, you know, my gut feeling was already when the first slide appeared, what the heck is this? Numbers show up that I don't recognize. So this is an example of where the facilitator is challenged by one of the participants. A conversation is turning out to be emotional and a bit tricky. And then this shows also how the facilitator has to be in contact with the group and try to read the situation and understand how to act. So what the facilitator did here was to continue with this open way of facilitating, but also trying to be a little bit more authoritative. So she said, the idea was that this would have been the last meeting before summer, but you can let me know if you want to have an additional meeting if you get worried. So this was after quite a long sequence of conversation on this working method, on this method that they discussed. The facilitator was then trying to close the meeting, but it turned out to be a little bit difficult to do that. The participants wanted still to continue this conversation and felt that there was additional need to discuss this working method because it was controversial, and it was needed to have a continued discussion. And then actually what happened was that the facilitator needed to end this meeting without coming to a real conclusion about the discussion on the working method. So this was an example of how a facilitator move between different ways of facilitating, trying to walk a balance and adjust towards what the situation requires in terms of leadership. Sometimes stepping into more strongly authoritative mood of facilitating at the left-hand side, sometimes moving towards argumentation, opening up for dialogues and different kinds of arguments about how to deal with the communicative process. So we can see in this material that facilitators are trying to move back and forth in view of creating trust and possibilities to act as facilitators. And the conclusions still preliminary, but this is how we see things currently. Facilitation is to be considered as use of power. It is a subtle form of power. It is a power that has to do with structuring conversations. So it will have actually quite important influence on the actual process of communication. And it might also, as I tried to show with this example, have implications for how the outcomes are in terms of sustainability measures and the field that the deliberation and communication is concerned with. And it requires authority then, it's a leadership role. And the facilitator, as I've been mentioning, we can see that they move back and forth between being an authority and between opening up for argumentation and dialogue with the participants. And what we pay particular interest to here is how facilitators are trying to do this work, being sensitive to what the situation requires. So you will have to read these relationships and see what the situation requires of you as a facilitator in order to be accepted as an authority and as a leader in this practice. Thank you for the attention.